the LinkedIn article that I wrote. I think it was 2 weeks ago, just around SQL Server on containers and Kubernetes, and just looking to see how people are feeling about it, whether it's being used, whether it's being used production-wise, whether it's being used in dev, or if there's any reason why it's not being used at the moment. In terms of the actual use for it, obviously it's really good in terms of microservices, edge devices, but we're also looking at it from the potential of being able to migrate even from operating systems and virtual machines to actually having SQL fully on containers and carrying the workload for that. So with that in mind, what I'm looking to do today is demonstrate a migration from Windows Server 2022 to Kubernetes. So this is a SQL Server 2022 instance. The reason why I'm using 22 version is purely because I'm going to show contained availability groups. So I'm not certain whether everyone's used it, whether you've looked into contained availability groups. But one issue that we have had in the past with availability groups is the ability to work with. Sorry, apologies for that. Yeah, so what I'm looking to do for contained availability group and what the reason for using contained availability group is one issue with availability groups that we have normally is when we look at logins and we look at SQL Agent Jobs especially, and you have to create them on all of the individual nodes. And then you potentially have competing jobs when you're running with them. Even more so, you can usually handle that by running a function to find out which one is the primary replica and running with that. But there are some applications out there which actually create jobs and delete jobs on the fly. Reporting services is a good example of that. And that becomes more problematic, and availability groups with the likes of SQL Server reporting services has been an issue in the past. So I want to show what contained availability groups can do as a way around and a way to improve it. Now, contained AGs are SQL Server 22, and because of that, they're a very new feature. There's still a work in progress, not certain how much they're being used in Anger at the moment. So as I'm going to go through this demo, there was a couple of things I wanted to show which I'm removing from it, and I'll explain a little bit further. Hopefully they will be in a demo a little bit further on. So I am going to continue working with them, and once they're ready, I will show them as well. But I'm going to show the main important ones, which are the databases themselves, the logins, credentials, which we can do, and also, most important, the SQL Agent job itself. A lot of what we're doing here, you can work with availability groups in 2019 as well and other versions. So you're not stuck on SQL 2022 to do this. The only reason I'm doing it is purely for the contained availability groups. So in terms of the software that's being used, as well as the SQL 2022, the Kubernetes and so on, the software for doing actually building the availability groups is something called DX Enterprise from a company called DH2I. And we have one or two members actually on the call. So if you are interested, if you've got any questions around that side of things, then feel free to ask, and there'll be someone who should be able to answer on that side, or certainly be able to get back to you anyway. And likewise, myself on the SQL Server side. So before I get into it, just to start off with showing a little bit about DH2I. They've got DX Enterprise with working with clustering, and also DX Odyssey for the networking side of things. So some very powerful tools. The good thing about the DX Enterprise software is it's multi-platform. So one issue that we have with SQL Server and availability groups is that we generally have to keep them on the same platform, on the same version even of the likes of SQL, Windows and so on. When we're working with DX Enterprise, I could have an availability group with a Windows server, a Linux server, and even Kubernetes containers all on the same cluster. So brilliant piece of software for that. There is a free trial, as you can see on this page. Just going to show one more, another article on this, because this is the YouTube channel, and there's one recording here on Migrate SQL, and that is working with, I think it's 2019, and that is just a standard availability group. So if you're interested and you see the contained AG is probably not the right solution for you, and you want to look at just a normal AG, have a look at this one. And it's a 9-minute recording of being able to set up the AG and migrate to from Windows to Kubernetes. And the final link that I'm going to show, if you've come on here through LinkedIn and you've seen the article from that, you will potentially have seen this GitHub project repository as well, around being able to build up SQL Server on Kubernetes. So there's quite a few topics that are covered. The first one about setting up everything. Don't know if anyone's tried it. If you have, or if you are going to do, and you run into any issues, just let me know what issues you're facing. There is a lot of stuff that's in here that it just goes ahead and does it. So there may be policies, certainly if you're working with Azure, that is, there may be policies that cause you problems. So if so, let me know. We can have a look at it and try and get this thing working. It builds up a Azure Kubernetes cluster. Now, that's just the example that I'm using. I'm working, everything that I'm doing is on Azure Kubernetes. Don't feel that you have to work with that. Obviously, if you're working in an on-prem environment, then you'll have your own Kubernetes setup. And this whole solution is around building it on Kubernetes and containers. So don't feel that it has to be Azure related. Azure is just the platform that I'm using to get the Kubernetes up. So following on from that, we've got links to build up the 2019 servers or containers and the availability group. Then again for 2022 and the contained AG. And then finally, there's also a bit of monitoring on there as well, and explaining potential issues with logins and how contained AGs can improve the way of working with logins. So we're going to move to the demo. In terms of all of the prerequisites from the demo, the first thing is that I've set up my Kubernetes, my Azure Kubernetes cluster. I've set up Windows authentication. I've skipped everything to do with 2019, and all of the rest is 2022. So the first two and these, pretty much everything as per this guide in order to build the solution. There is one slight change to it. So if I just jump on to my jump box. And I'll just quickly go to the change that I've made. And that is within the configuration file for SQL. And the change that I've made is in terms of the data and log directory. So if you use the example set up from the GitHub repository, what you would see is user data and log. For this demonstration, I'm just using data, and I'll explain why. There's a very big reason as to why I've done this. So I'll explain that as and when we come to it. It's around the databases, and when you're adding servers to an availability group. And one issue with Linux compared to Windows is the actual volume mapping, where I'm using F drive and G drive on my Windows server. I'm using this location on my containers Linux server. So there becomes a problem when you start using automatic seeding. And I'm going to explain that further when we come to it. So in terms of other prerequisites that I've done for this, so the first prerequisite is building up the SQL 22 on Kubernetes with the change of the data volume. So for data and log, they're both going to var opt MS SQL data. On the Windows side, I've spun up an Azure SQL VM that's called SQL Kubernetes IaaS 22. I've added mixed authentication to it, so it is using Windows and SQL authentication. The SQL authentication is required for the AG setup. It's going to be using SQL logins with certification. I've configured a static IP address, the typical sort of thing that you would do as you join the server to the domain. So my server is on the same domain as the containers themselves. Now, don't feel that when you're working with this and you're doing it either in practice or in production, that the containers have to be on a domain. They don't need to be. You can use SQL authentication on them, absolutely fine. The way I've done it is added that extra level of protection by adding Windows authentication into it as well. So with that, there's quite a few prerequisites that I have to set up. So I've joined the server to the domain. I've added the domain account as a sysadmin so that I can access through the domain as well as local on the server. I've set service principals for my server as well. So they're all going to be using the same SQL service account. The Linux containers, the main account for them, and also the service account for the Windows server are all using this account, SQL Kubernetes Service 22. So I've set up an SPN, service principal name, for all of them, and also for the listener, which will be on port 14033. I've then added it as the service account. I've enabled startup, automatic startup for the SQL agent. For some reason, it's set to manual on these boxes. In terms of ports, the main ones, I'm using this one purely for being able to move files to and from my jump box to the server itself. This one is for the listener, and this one is for database mirroring. In terms of everything else that DX Enterprise does, when you install the software, it actually enables these firewall rules. So other ports that you may see, I think there's 7979, something like that, that automatically gets enabled in the firewall when you install DX Enterprise on the server. I've restored 5 databases. We may not use all 5. Certainly going to have a go with them. Show hopefully how straightforward it is to add these into the availability group. I've created a Windows login and a SQL login on my Windows server. I've created a storage account as well. The storage account is going to be used for the credential. So all I've got on the blob storage account is a blob container with a SQL database backup. It's private, using private endpoint. In order to do a private endpoint over a domain, I'm going to be adding, or I have added, a DNS forwarder. So just to show you what that looks like, if I go to my domain controller, and then go to DNS, and if we look at conditional forwarders, there's one that was created automatically during the installation of Kubernetes as all part of the project that I did, and that created this one for the Azure Kubernetes service. This one I've created in order to work with private link. So if you are using Azure, that's how you work with private link and being able to set up the DNS. If you're not working with Azure, don't worry too much about that at all. Once I've done that, I'm using the access key for the credential. I've created a SQL Agent job, and then the DX Enterprise and DX Admin software have all been downloaded, and it's already installed on the jump box. So that's everything in terms of prerequisites. Let me just close all of these down. And now we're going to move on to actually having a look at my setup. So this is my Windows server, which has got the 5 databases already configured. In terms of how these databases are set up, we just go to my 22 box. And I've put a mixture of locations, because what you generally find is in production, there is a mixture of the databases in terms of file paths. So you'll find that the first 3 databases are on the F drive in the data folder, and also on the G drive in the log folder. In terms of the last 2, one is in this folder, default 1, and another one in default 2. So just a little bit of a mixture of that, and we'll see why later, why I've done that. So just testing everything's working. Also, before I forget, SQL Agent job, which is currently running. It is updating the person business entity table. All of these 5 databases are just a copy of AdventureWorks 2019, so they're all duplicates. In terms of the job, it is only working on the first database, and it's just inserting a new record into the person.address table every 2 minutes. So if I run this query against SQL 22DB1, you can see every 2 minutes it is adding a new entry with the server name and also the modified date, which is the get date each time it runs. The credential that I've created, that's showing that my credential is working. The credential itself is connected. It's called backup container. It's connecting to this URL, and it is using the access key. And this is just a blob storage account. This is an example that I'm using for the credential. You can use other forms of examples for working with credentials, just a file system, working with disks if you like. The way I'm doing it is just through blob container. There will be a slight difference when I actually do this on the Kubernetes side, but I'll explain that shortly. So that leaves us with these 2 users that I've created, my backup container credential and my job that I have on the server. If I go to another session that I have open, this session is using SQL User, which is the SQL authentication, and this one is using Windows User, which is the Windows authentication. Both of them have limited permissions. I've created them. Let me go back to here in the setup. In terms of the permissions for them, I've created the login for both. I've created a user for both in each of the 5 databases, and they just have DB data reader permissions, nothing else, only data reader permissions. So they're both working okay. All I'm interested in here is that they're both actually working fine once, well, now and then once we finish migrating. So that's the Windows server. Next, we're going to look at the individual containers. So this is the first pod 0. When we have a look at the databases on here, at the moment, there's no user databases, but because we've created a contained availability group, we do have these two that are listed as user databases, but they're actual replicated copies of the system databases, the individual databases that have been added as user, so that they are replicated between the nodes. So that is 0. This one is 1. I won't bother with 2, but that should be exactly the same. But when we have a look at the listener, it looks completely different. If we were looking at a normal availability group, you would see any user databases that are synchronized in the same way on the listener as you would on any of the nodes, because it would basically be just pointing at the primary node and showing you everything. For a contained availability group, you don't have that. You can see that there are no databases in here. And in fact, the system databases are actually these. So in terms of master and MSDB, they are the system databases for this listener. They are the ones that are stored on the actual underlying nodes. So you can also see that there is no availability group scenario set up here, because that is all hidden from you. So that is all how the contained AG looks from in terms of the nodes and also from the AG or the AG listener. So what I'm going to do now is install this software, DX Enterprise, onto my server. So if I go on to server 22 and go into downloads, I've already downloaded the software, so I just need to install it. Fairly straightforward in terms of installation. Happy enough with where it's going to go. So just continue with the defaults. And that doesn't take very long to install. So the next thing I'm going to do once it's finally installed is to activate the license on it. So if I go into the start and into DX Configuration Manager, and I get this pop up here, and I'm just going to click on Activate License, and I'm using the same license as the one that I've already used on my Kubernetes containers. So it's the same license, it's just the trial license that I'm using. So again, feel free to request a trial so that you can have a go at this yourself and do a proof of concept to test it. So I need to enter the license key and I need to accept the EULA. It takes a few seconds to activate. If it comes back with a failure, which it does sometimes do, just retry it. Eventually, it should work. There we go. So at that point, my Windows server is now activated and DX Enterprise is now running. You can see you can start and stop it. It's another service, but it is now running. So I can close this down and I can open DX Enterprise, DX Admin, should I say, on this server. When this opens up, it asks you to connect and it asks for the server name, a local account and passkey. This one hasn't yet been set up. It's only just started. So with localhost and the account as admin, I don't need to enter a passkey. I can just connect and it will show me the server, which is a node, but that's it. We've not got anything else set up at the moment. So I'm going to go back to the jump box and I'm going to open up DX Admin from here. And a little bit different on this side. So I've already set up my cluster as per the project, all of the instructions in there. So as part of that, obviously the virtual host, I've created that along the way. And there was also a command which asks you to create a passkey. So I'm going to use that passkey that was created. You always get this pop-up, very similar to when you're logging in using Linux, that it's using, it doesn't have a matching public hash key. Don't worry about that. You can click yes to that one. And you can see the setup that we have. So the green light there means everything is okay. You can see our 3 nodes. This is the host, the virtual host, and it is also the name of the listener, what we class as the listener for SQL. And this is the name of the availability group as well. So everything looking great from that side of things. So now I'm going to join my Windows server to this availability group. And to do that, I go to Advanced Configuration and Cluster Membership. And at the bottom, there is an option to manage the one-time passkey. So if I create a new one, and I'll just make this last until Saturday, and then click Set. And now I have the option to copy it. Now that that has been created, I could just go back into it. It will bring up the same passkey until it expires. So I'll close that and then go back to my Windows server. And on here, again, if I go to Advanced Configuration, Cluster Membership, and now I can join new cluster. When I do that, I get this pop-up box, leave the target cluster server as match.dh2i.com. That is the way that it's used to actually connect to the cluster. So this is all set up through the underlying DX Enterprise software. So everything else here is fine. All I need to do is to add the passkey. Now, I don't need to accept the EULA at this point because I have already done that. It doesn't do any harm to do it again. Let's click OK, and then yes. And then this is adding the Windows server to the cluster. So it's kind of like if you're using Windows failover cluster and you're creating an AT through the first thing you need to do is you have to add the node to the cluster, and then you have to add to the availability group. And that is what we've done here. It's now on our cluster, but it isn't yet on our availability group. Our green light at the top has now turned into a yellow amber warning, and this just relates to an host name lookup failure. You're going to get that when you're adding in Windows Server to the Kubernetes cluster, because it's been set up again through the configuration that all of these containers can look each other up over name rather than IP address. But because of that, it doesn't allow you to do the same with the Windows Server. So you are going to get these 3 warnings. Don't worry about that. We can continue with that anyway. So next, I need to add my availability, or add this to my availability group. So if I right click my virtual host and add a member, and you can see because it's already in the cluster, it appears here. Instance name, it could be any. In this case, I've only got 1 instance, which is the default. And then I need to authenticate, and this is where I'm using my Azure user SQL login that is a sysadmin on my Windows server. So if I use Azure user and then supply the password and submit, and then click OK. And this is telling me that it is now going to add it in, and it's also going to add it in using synchronous commit. It does also mention that replicas may restart multiple times. So initially, it's going to throw up some issues. They eventually should clear back down to these 3. And if I move over to my jump box and have a look from this side, and now do a refresh of this server, you can see I've got two databases synchronized on here as well. So it has managed to do these two databases and seed them. Now, the reason why it's gone through successfully and seeded them is because these databases, when you create the contained availability group on Linux, it will always create these databases in the MS SQL data folder. So var opt MS SQL data. If you have specified defaults outside of that, that's fine, but it will still put these databases in that data folder. Now that becomes a problem when you then come to add this to the availability group, because it will not pick them up as defaults and will actually try and restore to that path of var opt MS SQL data, and therefore throw an error because that doesn't exist on my Windows server. So for my example, or for this demonstration, I'm using the default data and log location as being data. If you're not using them, don't feel you have to, but you will have to work around, and I'll show you the workaround when we come to do these 5 databases, because I'm going to show the issue that you actually face with these. We can have a look at my test queries again for this server, just to make certain everything else is working okay. So this has stopped. It hasn't taken the 441. When we come to 442, so it's just ticked now, you can see it's restarted and it's populating with a new record. So that shows that my SQL Agent job is still working absolutely fine. And so too is my credential. So what I want to do now is, before I move the databases over, I want to script out all of the dependencies. So I've got a file here already, but I'm going to show any differences that I make from these, from anything in this file. So the first one, create the login for Windows and also for SQL. So if I go into the logins, all I've actually done here is just scripted that Windows user to get this. It's basically, if I just put that to a new window, you can see it's exactly the same as the one I've got here. SQL user, slightly different. Now, when you're coming to do this, you'll probably use the SPL Rev login script in order to be able to generate all of your logins. I'm just simply doing it by scripting. So when I script the SQL login, it gives me the hash password, but the main thing I need to add is this, the SID of my SQL login. So to get that, I'm just going to run, this one to get my server principals, and that gives me, hopefully, the correct SID. So that SID is obviously important to make certain that you don't end up with an orphaned user that doesn't match the SQL login. We don't generally have that issue with Windows unless we've got multiple domains. So that one's fine, but for the SQL login, we generally have an issue. So I've matched the SID. Hopefully that fixes that. In terms of the credential, so if I script, or if I go to the credential, you can't actually script it out. You could just query it. And all it gives you is the name and the identity. So you have to go back and get your own, the secret again in order to work with that. But that's all you need for your credential: the name of it, the identity, and the secret. And that should work exactly the same for Kubernetes as it does for Windows. In terms of this one, because I'm using Azure, it's not quite the same. So the credential that I used initially was this one, where the credential is called backup container. The identity is the name of the storage account, and then I'm using access key. Now, Kubernetes and PaaS services don't allow you to use the access key. You have to use something called the shared access signature. So I've had to recreate the credential this way. But that's, again, not anything to do with an issue with Kubernetes or Windows or anything like that. It's purely with blob storage in Azure, and Kubernetes and PaaS services, they use the shared access signature. Windows Server, they use the access key, and you could create a credential, and then when you use the restore file list only, you have to specify with credential. You don't for containers. So slightly different, but purely because of Azure and nothing else. Otherwise, you would script out the credential, or you would get the credential exactly the same as how you've done it on Windows. In terms of server audit and server audit specification, there is a current problem with this one. I'm going to try and get back and address why we've got the issue. It's purely because of contained availability groups. It's not related to containers. It's not related to SQL 2019. So if you were to use availability groups, it will work absolutely fine. But for contained AGs, we just have a slight problem with SQL Server audit, and the same with link server as well. There's an issue with them too. So hopefully I'll come back and I'll do another recording just for them too, but we're going to skip these two for now. So now we're ready to restore the databases. So I need to put them into full recovery. All of them at the moment will be in simple recovery. And then I need to back them up. Now, generally, you only need a full backup. I'm actually going to take a full and a log backup here, and I'll explain why shortly. And now they've backed up. I want to put them in that folder, and they should all be on my SQL 22 box in the backup folder. So they're all here. So if I just copy these across. And now let me add these dependencies. Okay, so these are the dependencies that I've kind of scripted, and I need to add them to my availability group. So I'm going to connect to my availability group, not the nodes, just the availability group for now. And then I'm going to create this Windows user and or Windows login and the SQL login. This is the error that's come up here. Again, it relates to an AD issue I've been having on these servers. I'm going to look to see whether it's anything problematic that may be in my installation setup the way I've configured it, or whether there is a slight problem and we need to have a look at it a little bit further in terms of a bug. I'm not too certain why the issue is at the moment, but what's happening is whenever I create anything server side, on my AG, it then kind of logs me out and won't let me log back in, or won't let me connect back up. So what I need to do is just change connection and reconnect to my server, and now it should let me in. You will see this happen a few times as I'm doing this. So that's both of the logins set up. The credential for this, I'm actually not going to do it on the node, on the AG. I'm going to do it on each individual node. If you try creating this on the availability group, it does seem to let it through, but it does put it on the node you're on, and therefore won't work when you fail over to other nodes. So we seem more interested at the moment in using contained availability groups to work with logins and jobs. Them seem to be the main priority. Everything else, it's not quite there yet. So I'm going to put this one on each of the nodes, whereas the login and the job I've actually put on the AG. Okay, so the credential is on each node. The logins are on the AG. So these logins, you will be able to see them from my AG, but you won't be able to see them from each node. So just to show that, if we look at my node 0, go into SQL, into security and logins, you can see there is no sign of Windows user or SQL user. But if I go to the listener itself and have a look on here, they are both there. So you could create the logins on the nodes if you wish, but you can actually do this on the availability group listener, and it doesn't create them in the individual nodes. So you can use this just to run it once and then fail over, and these logins, like the databases, they will fail over with you. So that's a way of not having to worry about putting these logins on each individual node. And the same will apply to the SQL Agent job when we come to do that. So that's the logins, that's the credential taken care of. I haven't done the job yet. I'm going to do the job once the databases have been restored. So the next thing I need to do is get the databases on. And to do that, I need to fail over to this server. So to do that, I right click it and start hosting on member. Now, because of the setup I have, sometimes it doesn't take to it first time and it may fail back. Not always and not usually, but there are the odd times when it does. If it does, just make certain everything's okay. Try it again. Second time should be absolutely fine. But in this case, it looks like it's gone over okay. So let me have a look at my instances. I need to make certain that they have all failed over and the databases are synchronized. That one looks good. And so does that one. So everything in sync, and we are now on our Windows server. So now with my database backups that I have taken, if I go to the availability group and manage availability databases, you can see all 5 databases are now listed because it is looking at the primary, which is my IaaS Windows server. So I'm just going to move one database just for the time being and click submit. Now, you may find it works. You may find it doesn't work. In this case, I think it's going to fail. It's not a major issue, but I'm going to show you the reason why it's failed and some options that are open to you. So on the Windows Server side, it's now synchronized. If I go to the listener, you can now see the databases there. But if I have a look at this server, MS SQL 22.0, and just do a refresh here, you can see the database isn't appearing. So let me have a look into the SQL logs. So what we're going to find when the log appears is it's going to tell us that it is trying to restore the database to the file location of F data and G log. And that is because the database on Windows was set up there. So it's looking up for G log and also F data. And again, that is because on my Windows server, if we have a look at the database settings, the defaults are F data and G log. Now, it can work using that, and the database that I've moved over is actually sat on there. So usually that should work. For some reason, for me, it isn't working. But it can happen, especially if you've got databases that are not on the default locations. So if you find it is working for all databases that you have on the defaults, but it's not on any of the others, what you could do is potentially change the default locations to match the one that the database you're looking to migrate, and then you'll need to restart the instance and then try and add that database in. That's one way of working. It won't work for me in this case. I've got databases on a few different folder locations. So for me, the automatic seeding isn't going to work, even if I try changing these backup, these database default locations. So instead, what I'm going to do is first, I'm going to remove that database. So if I go back to my availability group, manage the database, and remove that. And now you can see it's removed from here. Before I can do anything else with it, I will need to take another full unlog backup of that database. And then I'll need to copy them both over. So what I'm doing here as a way to get around it is the old way of working with AGs. Hopefully, there's going to be a better way of doing this shortly. It has been raised as a potential bug that we'd like to have improved. But for the time being, there is a way around, and that is to back up the database and the log, put them on to each of the nodes that you're going to be adding in, and then restoring them with no recovery. So my backups are now in a central location. I'm now going to send them all to each node. So starting with node 0, this is just copying all of the backup and log backup files and sending them to node 0. Then the same with node 1. And finally node 2. And now I can restore these database, both the database backup file and the log backup file, both in no recovery. So I have to do this again on each node. Okay, just one more to do. And while that's working, if we just have a look at my SQL 22.0 box, we can now see the 5 databases that are in restoring mode, and the same applies to the other 2. So they're all there, they're just restoring. And now I can right click my availability group, manage availability databases, and add all 5 of these. No matter of where the file locations are for these databases. And now I've submitted. If I refresh, we can see they're now starting to come up and synchronize. Okay, so all of the databases are synchronized on 22.0. They should all be synchronized here. So all of the databases are now up. They're now joined to the AG. And that just leaves me with the job. So again, like the logins, I'm going to put the job on my listener. Now at this point, now I've added the databases into the availability group, the job on this server, my Windows server, will be failing. But in fact, the agent's down. But even if it was up, it would be failing at this point. But we're interested in getting it over to our SQL Containers AG. So not concerned about that on the Windows server. It's about the migration to the AG. So this is now all set up. What I need to do now is fail back over to MS SQL 22.0. So if I right click and start hosting, and that is now showing us set up on my 22.0 box. It will take a little bit of time, and you can sometimes see the odd blip purely because of the Windows server again. Let's just see if it all comes up and works. If you do find that databases on this server end up in synchronizing mode rather than synchronized, then just restart the instance and that fixes the problem. So just got to wait another, probably about a minute for these databases to come up on my container, my 22.0 container. Okay, so all of the databases, especially these ones, they're all now synchronized on 22.0. Let's go to the Windows server. And as you can see, these three are synchronized. These ones, for some reason, are still showing as synchronizing. And if I have a look at MS SQL 22.1, we may find, yeah, the same applies here. So just to resolve that, if I go back to my 22 box and just give my instance another restart, it's not a major problem now because this server is a secondary, it's not the primary. So it doesn't cause any issues to restart the instance. And now if I do a refresh, they're all synchronized. It's all caught up. And the same should apply to instance 1 as well. So everything's good. Everything's failed over. It's now on my containers. Everything's been migrated. All that's left to do is to remove this server, which we don't need anymore. So if I right click the server, I can remove it, remove member. That just leaves these three. And then if I go back to the server itself and use dxadmin from here, again, you can see it's been removed from the AG. All I want to do now is in the same box that I've got here, advanced configuration and cluster membership, this box here, you can see all of the servers that are joined to the cluster. I just right click, delete, select yes, and I think I need to submit as well. Yep, submit, and then click yes again. And that should remove it. And as you can see, it is back to how it was when we initially activated it, just the server on its own. And if I go back to the jump box, my availability group is up and we've got the green light again. Now we've removed the Windows server from it, it's all happy and it's working, hopefully, as expected. So if I open up some test queries now on here, not worried about anything to do with link server or the audit. So the same queries that we had before. So if I change the connection to my listener and then run this query, you can see not only am I returning data from SQL 22 DB1, but it's also now running the job. And you can see it was last done at 5:10, it says there, which is local UTC time, 5:10. And it's showing my primary MS SQL 22.0 as the server. The container is working fine. So this is my credential. My credential's working fine. Remember, for the credential, I actually added it to all three nodes, whereas the job I only put on the listener itself. So them are both working. I'm going to go to here now to test the Windows server, the Windows user and the SQL user. So if I change this connection and make this the listener using my Windows user account, and that is working fine. And then this one, if I've got the SID correct, okay, if I run that, yeah, everything is working from there as well. So Windows user, SQL user, they all work fine. If I go and change the connection and I use this to MS SQL 22-0, which is my primary node, it fails. Login failed for Windows user. And that is because the Windows user login and the SQL user login have been created on the listener, but not on the underlying node. So they don't exist on here. If you want to add them, you can. There's no problem with adding them on the nodes as well. But this shows you that you don't need to do. And it probably helps in terms of security, because it means that if anyone has an account, and they should only be accessing via the application or via the listener, you can prevent them from accessing via the node itself, because you don't need to create the logins on each individual node, just the listener itself. And that's the real benefit of using contained AGs. So one final thing that I'm just going to show, if I, again, run this query, again, AD issue, just run that query again. You can see MS SQL 22.0. Let me just fail over to my second node. Does take a little bit longer because we've got 5 user databases and also their 2 system databases. So if it was a standard AG, it might be a bit quicker failing over. Because it's this contained AG, it does take a little bit longer, but you can see it's happy. Everything seems to be okay now. So the time is 5:16, hopefully. The job's just run again. And you can see the job has run on SQL instance 1. So I only ran the job and created the job on the listener. I didn't create it on each individual node. And again, you can see that by going into the listener itself, going into the SQL agent and job activity monitor, and you can see my job is there. But if I go to the node and look at the SQL agent job activity monitor here, there are no jobs. So again, the job is only on the listener, and that is another good reason of using contained availability groups.